So it is our great pleasure to welcome today David Allison in our Philosophy in Biology and Medicine seminar series. As you know, the goal of these seminars is to raise conceptual, theoretical, societal, sometimes questions about science. And it's really a great honor to have David today. I really want to thank Jonathan Scholl, who suggested David's name, and I think it was a great suggestion. And now Jonathan will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Taman. Thank you very much, David, for being with us. So just to say a few words about David before getting started. So he's currently the director and endowed chair of the USDA Children's Nutrition Research Center at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. And please stop me if I get any of these things wrong, David. But I believe he assumed the role after stepping down as Dean of Indiana University School of Public Health in Bloomington in 2025, a position that he held since 2017. And the USDA Center at Baylor is one of only 4 human nutrition centers in the nation, in the United States, housed at academic institutions, and is recognized for its significant contributions to nutrition science, to policy, and practice. Allison is a highly accomplished researcher with over 600 scientific publications and more than 25 years of continuous NIH, or National Institute of Health, funding as a principal investigator. His areas of expertise include body fat, weight loss, obesity, weight cycling, longevity, a variety of kind of issues specific to the nutrition sciences, also some very interesting papers that I'm also personally interested in around the protein debates and the effects of protein on longevity and mortality risks, but also on questions that we'll hear as well about tonight regarding statistical design, analysis, meta-analysis, causal inference, rigor, reproducibility, transparency. So both the specific kind of questions facing the nutrition and obesity research, but also these kind of meta-scientific questions on how to do good and rigorous science. So bringing together 2 very interesting aspects of this work. So thank you very much, David, for being here, and we look forward to hearing the talk.
Thank you. Well, it is truly a privilege and an honor to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I want to thank all the audience for coming and letting me share some ideas with you, and I hope you'll share some of your ideas with me. I want to start by particularly thanking some of my colleagues and mentorees who have helped me over the years generate some of these ideas, but especially in recent times, Olivia Robertson, who helped me prepare these slides, and she did terrific work on that. So thank you all. I'm not going to read these in details, but the slides either have been made available to you or can be made available to you. You can email me if you want them, or Jonathan should have them, and Thomas should have them, and they can share them with you if you wish. This is meant to indicate the idea of conversation, that I don't mind being interrupted. So this talk is meant to be sort of a meandering walk through the garden of thought and data. I'm going to use obesity and nutrition, mostly obesity and nutrition, but not only, data and examples to make some points. The points I make are not exclusive or exhaustive of all the things related to this. As I say, it's kind of a meandering walk together to say, how do we do science? Why do we do science? How might we do it better? And so I think of this as a conversation, and please feel invited to stop me and ask a question or make a point at any time. Here's an outline of what I'll go through. Start with trust and trustworthiness in science and distinguish between those, detecting and correcting errors, preventing errors, some possible solutions, and some conclusions. So why do we do science? Science is so important, and it's just one illustration of the social importance we give to science and its special privileged role in knowledge is the fact that Abraham Lincoln inaugurated the National Academy of Sciences in the United States at almost the exact same time as he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, literally 2 months later. So he's thinking about the biggest issues in the history of our country. He's trying to win the Civil War. He's emancipating and ending slavery. And yet at the same time, he stops to say, let's form a National Academy of Sciences. And why does he do that? And he says, because we need that academy to advise us on matters of critical importance to the nation and the world. And it's important that he says advise us. He doesn't say tell us what we must do and mandate things. And he doesn't say just to go off and think like some dispassionate scholars who are not connected to anything. He says advise us. So be in the real world, be involved in us making decisions, but be involved, you're not you, the academy, are not going to get to determine the decision. And so he's already laid the groundwork for the idea that policy and action should be science or evidence influenced or informed, but not determined. And I think we hear that a lot in among scientists. Policy should, or occasionally you hear must, be evidence-based or science-based, which I think is patently wrong. I think it's that science or policy and action should be evidence-informed. That is, I want to know what the evidence says on things before I make decisions about them, if I can, if there is evidence, and I want to know whether there's evidence. But there's still other factors that come into play, like preferences, tastes, morals, values, and so forth. And those are not determined by science. But when we talk about the objective part, science is the best way of coming to knowledge from the objective world. Science comes from the Latin scientia, meaning to know, and more importantly, to come to know. That is, it is a process by which we come to know. So we do science to come to know knowledge, to appreciate the beauty of nature as well. You look at the image behind me, and that's not an accident that I put it there. That's from an old book in the public domain, a magazine for kids, and it's about the idea of the joy of science. But I'm a kid at heart, and I love kids' books, and I especially love kids' books about science. I like reading them, and I find them inspirational. And I like this picture. I think it's inspirational, and it captures one element of science, which is the beauty of it. It's sort of science as joy, science as art, science as sport. And there's a connection of all those things to science. In addition to the practical aspect that the Abraham Lincolns of the world are interested in, which is science as practical knowledge to help us make decisions. So we do it in part to appreciate the beauty of nature, and for that it has to reflect nature. To predict and control aspects of our environment, now we're back to the practicality, solve practical real-world problems, to guide humanity toward a better tomorrow. Now, why does science get a privileged voice, or why should science get a privileged voice in matters of objective reality? And I think that Adam Smith put this well, and he said, science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. And if we elaborate on that a little bit, what we're saying is that science is itself a bias reduction technique. That is not only what science is. It is also a discovery technique and a vetting technique and so on. But it is in part a bias reduction technique. And because of that, we're always refining it, right? There was a point where we didn't do randomized controlled trials or trials at all. And then eventually people started to learn to do trials, as in, for example, with scurvy and James Lind. But those initial trials were not blinded, and they were not randomized. We later learned to randomize. We later learned to blind. And so each time we say, aha, here's a weakness. This could have been due to a placebo effect or to non-randomized, confounding in a non-randomized experiment. And we said, well, let's randomize. Okay, let's blind. And so we're always improving, and that's been since the history of science, and it still goes on today. Some people sort of opine that, well, there's a crisis in science, a reproducibility crisis you hear about sometimes, or a replicability crisis, or something else. But in fact, I don't think there's any crisis in the sense, if you define crisis as things have gotten much worse than they used to be, and this is a new issue. This is not a new issue at all. If you go back to all the way back to Ptolemy, you'll start to see concerns about data science, about data quality. And here's a nice quotation from 1942. Incipient and actual attacks upon the integrity of science have led scientists to recognize their dependence on particular types of social structure. Manifestos and pronouncement by associations of sciences are devoted to the relations of science and society. An institution under attack must re-examine its foundations, restate its objectives, seek out its rationale. Crisis invites self-appraisal. Now that they have been confronted with challenges to their way of life, scientists have been jarred into a state of acute self-consciousness, consciousness of self as an integral element of society, and so on. From Robert Merton, 1942. Now, if I had showed you this and not put at the bottom who said it and when, you might have said, oh, this was said by somebody last week in response to what's going on in the world today, especially what's coming at the scientific community from the United States federal government. And it would fit. But it also fit in 1942 when Robert Merton said it. So I think in some sense, we as scientists ought to think that the concerns we have, both from the outside looking in and from within, are somewhat normative. Somewhat. I'm not saying that there's no difference over time, but they're somewhat normative. And the ones from within are good. This is what we should be. This is what makes us scientists, that we're always reevaluating what we do, looking for the weaknesses, making them better, making the process of science itself better. So a meta process of science is the idea that we're always looking at ourselves and refining the process by which we do scientific research to lead to an understanding of the real world on some topic. So science can go wrong. There have been problems in science since the beginning of science. Science itself is a process, we might say, but it is done by humans, and humans are imperfect, and we make mistakes. And this is a taxonomy that my colleagues and I came up with about some of the ways that science can go wrong. You can have probably what we think of as the most egregious forms, all the way on the left. That's fabrication and falsification. That's lies, okay? All the way on to the right, where it's not so much wrong science, although we can argue about that a little bit, but it's weak science, and it's inappropriately weak science. I won't go through all these in great detail because it would take a long time, but they're fun stories. It's very clear in brief that Gregor Mendel fudged his data. Sir Ronald Fisher from the UK, probably the greatest statistician of the 20th century, is the one who sort of really detected that initially, I believe, and pointed that out. His data, Mendel's data, too closely matched the theoretical expectations to be real. He probably cleaned them up. So he got the right answer, mostly. He didn't get the right answer about linkage, right? He didn't understand linkage. So he has the second law of assortment, second law of inheritance, which is the law of independent assortment. And that would only be true if genes were unlinked, right? He didn't know anything about chromosomes. So he found 7 unlinked loci, but the probability of him getting 7 unlinked loci by chance in a species with the size of the genome of the pea plant is close to 0. Okay, Pasteur, distortion. Again, got the right answer, but he selectively published, particularly in his work on spontaneous generation, where he got the right answer that spontaneous generation is not a thing, but to show it, he suppressed some of his data. A more honest and appropriate way of not necessarily showing all the data was in Eddington confirming Einstein's theory, where he had to throw out one of the measurements he made in order for the results to conform to Einstein's theory. Had he not thrown out an outlier, the results would have conformed more to Newton's theory. He would have gotten the wrong answer. That is, Eddington would have gotten the wrong answer. But Eddington, to his credit, openly showed the data and then said, I'm going to exclude that data point. So nothing was hidden. Interestingly, Einstein was asked by a reporter years later, how would you have felt, Professor Einstein, if Lord Eddington had not supported your theory with the experiment? And Einstein replied, I would have felt very bad for the good Lord because it would have meant that the experiment was wrong. Right? So Einstein was so confident in his theory, the data almost didn't matter to him. But it was good that Eddington showed this. Then there are honest errors, Blanc and Enrays, and as Nancy, named for the town of Nancy in France. You may have never heard of Enrays. That's because they don't exist. But Blanc thought they existed. There's no evidence that he was malfeasant. It looks like it was an honest mistake. And Robert Wood from Johns Hopkins University, a physicist, went over, played a little trick on him, pulled a piece of machinery that was essential out of his apparatus when the professor wasn't looking, and then got him to repeat the result, and he still found the result. And then, the trickster said, look, I pulled the prism out of your thing. It shouldn't even work, and yet you're still finding it. Linus Pauling made a famous mistake, thinking the structure of DNA was a triple helix, not a double helix, because the government took away his passport at the time because he was an anti-nuclear protester. So again, the kinds of strange times we live in now are not so new to us. And he could not get over to England to see the good X-ray crystallography data of Rosalind Franklin that Watson and Crick were able to be there and see. And had he been there, he probably would have been the first to discover the double helix nature. Then there are parts where people use just substandard methods. And so there's this famous case of children's thymus glands, the norms for them coming from cadaver studies. And as you might guess, cadavers don't become cadavers randomly. So poor people tend to become cadavers, at least at that time, maybe still, I don't know, more often than non-poor people. And poor children tend to be undernourished, at least at that time. And undernourished children tend to have abnormally small thymus glands. And so what people thought were normal thymus glands were really abnormally small thymus glands. And what people thought were enlarged thymus glands were actually normal thymus glands. So when some children died of sudden infant death syndrome and some physicians measured their thymus glands, they concluded incorrectly that they were unusually large. And then children started getting irradiated who had normal thymus glands, but that people thought had abnormally large thymus glands that might be causing SIDS. Thymus glands is near the thyroid. You irradiate it. You put people at risk for thyroid cancer. And so there were children who got thyroid cancer as a result of treatment that was never needed, as a result of bad sampling. But that bad sampling or substandard methods should have been known to any competent statistician or epidemiologist even decades back when these studies were done. And so that's an example of substandard methods that were inappropriate. And then finally, we have weak science, where it's not necessarily wrong, but it's very weak. And that might be using some self-report measure for dietary intake or something like that. And the question is, can we get past that? So these are sort of a taxonomy of some of the ways things go wrong. Now, we often hear in our field, in any field of science, we need to trust science. We need to increase the trust in science. And I do hope we have trust in science. Depending upon what that means, I'm not sure we don't have trust in science or that it's down. We'll come back to that. But what I would contend is that as scientists, our first responsibility in this domain should be to promote trustworthiness and then to ask for trust. That is, to ask for trust as a blanket, just trust me, I'm a scientist, is antithetical to the whole idea of science. The whole idea of science is don't trust me. Who am I? I don't matter. What matters are the data, the methods used to collect the data, which give them that probative value, and the logic that connects those data and methods to conclusions. That is what science is. Anything else is tangential. So my degrees, my background, how many papers I've published, whether you like me or not, where I receive funding from, all of that is smoke, but it's not fire, right? That might tell you as a heuristic that you do or don't want to listen to me initially, but if it's really science, I don't matter. What matters are the data, the methods, and the logic, connecting them to conclusions. So we need to make not people say, trust me or don't trust me, but trust or don't trust the data, the methods, conclusions, the science, as in the specific research. And I think that's where things have broken down a little bit. There is little to no evidence, as far as I can tell, that there is any breach in the trust of science or decrement in the trust of science worldwide or in the United States. Which by that I mean trust in science as a process. That is, I don't hear people saying we shouldn't trust science to give us the answer to this empirical question about the observable world. We should use voodoo or tarot cards or roll the bones or something like that. What I hear is people talk about molecules and vaccines and viruses and things like that. That sort of suggests that they're trusting science to give them the answers. Now, where we may differ is when we start to move from science as an abstract process to who does this science? How was that particular science done? What finding was made? And then if you say to people, trust, quote, the science, then I think things are a little different. But even there, I don't trust all science. If you said to me, do you trust that study? I might say, to a reasonable degree of certainty, yes, because I know how it was done, I know it was done well, and so on. Do you trust that study? And I might say no, because I don't know how it was done, or I know the actors involved and they're not trustworthy, or that method is sloppy, or whatever. So we make a distinction between, do you trust the science as a process, the fundamental abstract process, or do you trust specific scientists or specific communicators in the scientific domain? Or do you trust a specific study, or do you trust a specific conclusion? Those are all very different things. So we seem to have trust in science as an abstract process. What we need to work on is trust in specific research. And to do that, we need to make the research trustworthy. And in my opinion, that it comes in degrees. But in general, some research is highly trustworthy and some is very low on trustworthiness. All right. We hope that when science consistently demonstrates trustworthiness, this will increase the trust in science in the eyes of the public. Whether that's actually true or not, maybe we need to continue to evaluate. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this sort of reinforces what I've said, that really trust in science is actually not down so much as some people opine. This is from a paper I published along with some others. This was led by Arthur or Skip Lupia from University of Michigan. Did a terrific job with this. And again, it reinforces the points that I've made in the last couple of minutes. Now, what are some of the factors contributing to a lack of trustworthiness and then potentially also lack of trust? Here are just some examples. These are just handpicked by us because we thought they're interesting. But it talks about, you can see these headlines: medicine is plagued by unworthy clinical trials that are either faked or flawed, zombie trials that still get cited despite the fact that they've been shown to be incorrect, inappropriate, and so on. And John Carlisle's been good at looking at this, and he's looked at randomized studies and found that a very large proportion of randomized trials have baseline distributions that don't look so random. And he's followed up with many of them. We've done a little bit of that work as well, not on the scale he's done it. He's followed up with many and then subsequently exposed that many were incorrect or incorrectly reported. We've done the same thing and had some papers retracted as a result of our work. And so this is a pretty big problem. One of the things that was really disappointing is that one of the most well done, otherwise well done and important studies in the entire field of nutrition, which is called the PrediMed study. It's one of the very few studies that show that with a nutritional intervention, we can actually get reductions in hard endpoints like heart attacks and mortality, as opposed to intermediary endpoints like blood pressure and cholesterol, right? Lots and lots of trials show we can manipulate blood pressure and cholesterol and body weight and things like that with dietary interventions. But the PrediMed study, which is a study of the Mediterranean diet, showed we could manipulate in a good positive way hard endpoints. And then John Carlisle dug in and found that something was wrong with the randomization. Turned out that some of the sites randomized entire villages or towns or groups of people or what have you. So it wasn't truly an appropriately randomized controlled trial. And the authors then retracted the paper from the New England Journal of Medicine, the lead paper. There have been hundreds of papers on this now, the lead paper, and republished it, but republished it without words like causation and instead had words like association. At the highest levels of our government in the United States, there's been a recognition of this need for greater science, including, lingering in the background or not so much in the background, is concerns about hegemonies. Hegemonies mean, one group says we have the truth and, you can't question it and everybody believes this. And many people even forget to question it because it seems like it's just well-established knowledge. We have a lot of those kinds of hegemonies in science. And I think often, very loosely speaking in the United States, we tend to think about there being two political, this political spectrum or continuum that goes from left to right, so to speak. Some people say liberal to conservative, some people say left to right, Democrat, Republican, blue, red. Doesn't all line up that way, of course. We know there's more than one continuum. But if we take that as a loose approximation, I think there's often a sense from each party that it's the other end of the continuum that are the distorters and the oppressors and the ignorers of science or the misusers of science and so on. And I think most of academic scholars, colleagues, faculty, researchers are, this is well established, tend to be more on the left side of the political spectrum. And so there's a sense of the pushback. And what we see is that no side owns distortion. No side owns oppression. No side owns hegemony. Both sides engage in all those things, knowingly or unknowingly, intentionally or unintentionally. Jay Bhattacharya is, in my opinion, an outstanding scholar who was appointed head of NIH. And as he himself has said, had it not been for COVID, he probably would not be head of NIH right now. But what happened in COVID is he looked at some data and he said some things that were consistent with data and, in my opinion, good thinking, but were not part of the hegemony of most of academic science. And because of that, he was sort of shunned somewhat and suffered as a result of that, as did some others. That doesn't mean his perspectives and conclusions were the ones you or I would come up with, but that's okay. People are allowed to come up with different conclusions about what we should do. It's back to that evidence-informed versus evidence-based, right? So we're all entitled to our own conclusions about what we should do, but hopefully we're not, as people have said, all entitled to our own facts. And so what Jay did is he laid out some facts, and he laid out some conclusions. Some people didn't like his conclusions and suggested that he wasn't being good with the facts. I think he was good with the facts. May or may not have been good with the conclusions, or may, I shouldn't say good with, but may or may not have given conclusions you or I or someone else would have given. And that's fair game. That's where we have differences in opinions and values and risk tolerances and preferences and so on. But I think because of that, that's why he was brought in by the federal government, because he appealed to them in the current situation. And he's trying to really say, you know what, we need to look at this from both sides and we need to tighten up the rigor. He is a very rigorous scientist himself. He's been about debunking things long before COVID. And this is what he wrote here. And he's talked specifically about nutrition and talked about the need. He's used the phrase reproducibility crisis and the need to do better. Okay, I seem to be stuck here. Why is that? There we go. This is Andrew Bremer, who's a wonderful colleague and member of the research and science community. He is the director of the Office of Nutrition Research at the National Institutes of Health. He also happens to have done his fellowship at Baylor College of Medicine, where some of my colleagues and I are now. So we're very proud of him. And you can see what he's written here. I won't read the whole thing to you. But again, what he's saying is we need more rigor and reproducibility in nutrition research. We need to start getting it right. And interestingly, he said a lot of these things before the current presidential administration was in place. And so this is not, he's not saying this as a result of simply doing what the people above him in the government say. This is what he said and believed before the current governmental leadership was in place. All right, now what about detecting and correcting errors? Detecting errors in the scientific literature is vital. We need to do that, and it goes to identifying misconduct, but even things beyond misconduct, just mistakes. We need timely identification of them. We need ongoing education to try to prevent them. And we need to have an ethical standard of correcting them. And unfortunately, that is not the case. One of the things that's interesting to me is, in many aspects of life where we produce things that we think are important, like airplanes, motor vehicles, there is testing that goes on so that we periodically stop and check the plane or check the motor vehicle or the parts coming off the assembly line to make sure they're okay. And I don't think any of us would want it any other way. But where's the standardized mechanism that checks the scientific literature? Every once in a while, the health inspector can show up at the restaurant unannounced and do an inspection. Every once in a while, the OSHA, Office of Safety and Occupational Health, can show up at the workplace and check if some safety protocols are being followed. Every once in a while, the FDA can show up at a trial site and check that the trial's going on. But where's the group that every once in a while, randomly or not so randomly, pulls a paper out of the scientific literature and says, we have the authority of our society to check that? And by society, I mean with a big S, as in like United States or any other country, not some academic society. We have the authority to check that, and we're going to check it. If something's wrong, we'll have that one fixed. But also by having this periodic check, we're going to be able to monitor whether things are getting better or worse. We're going to monitor how many mistakes are out there. We're also going to set a standard for people. I think that's something we need. One of the things my group and I have found is that it is incredibly easy to find mistakes in the literature. And I mean serious invalidating errors. We use the phrase invalidating error to mean that if it was fixed, it either would or could conceivably change the results and conclusions. And every week we prepare something called the Obesity and Energetics offerings. And if you're interested in obesity and energetics, and you haven't signed up, you can sign up for free. There's no charge. And then every week you'll get an email, and the email will contain about 100 lists of interesting documents and papers and things that came out in the world that week on obesity and energetics. And we don't give any real commentary with it. We just put them out and say, we think these are interesting. Maybe you will too. People really enjoy it. In the process of doing that, every week I spend many hours and look at literally hundreds of titles and then some subset of abstracts and full papers as for potential inclusion. A common experience is that I see an interesting title and I go, that's interesting. And I, click on the abstract and I read it and it says, I don't know what, eating walnuts, cures depression. And I go, that's a big claim. And then I look in and go, I'm not sure this makes sense. Something doesn't seem right. And then I'll send it around to some of my colleagues and mentorees and say, hey guys, take a look at this. Do you think this makes sense and could be true? And a very large proportion of the time, one of them comes back and says, no, it doesn't make sense and it can't be true. And here's why. And then sometimes we write to the authors or the editors and try to, get the raw data, see if we can reproduce it. If there is a mistake, fix it. And it is amazing how easy it was to find that anomaly in the first place and how hard it is to get it fixed. We just yesterday received news that one of our letters to the editor that will result in a correction to a paper will be appearing soon, anytime next few days or weeks. It took over 2.5 years of wrangling with the journal to get them to acknowledge that there was something seriously wrong with this paper and it needed to be fixed. There are many kinds of problems. One is problems with randomization. And again, what we see is we can detect the error, but then getting it to be fixed is difficult. So you can see a comment on the left from us pointing out that a paper on which policy was being made and government resources were being spent was patently wrong. Patently wrong. Not my opinion that they could have done a little better. They did a completely invalid, meaningless statistical test. We pointed that out. The author's response, or part of their response, is on the right. And they basically say, hey, David Allison and his colleagues, they probably don't know how hard it is to do this kind of research. To which my response is, you're right, I probably don't know how hard it is to do the kind of research you do. So what? Do you think the rules of probability care about how hard it is to do your research? Do you think your evidence becomes stronger because it was more difficult to collect better evidence? Your evidence may be more dispositive of a decision you want to make when you know it's difficult to collect better evidence. You might say, when I can't collect good evidence well, I'm willing to use weak evidence to make a decision. Well, that's fine. I make decisions all the time on weak evidence or sometimes on no evidence, right? So, Valentine's Day was a week or so ago, and I bought my wife a gift. I know of no randomized controlled trials showing that you should buy your spouse a gift on Valentine's Day. But I think it's a good idea, especially for all you young guys who just recently got married. Take my advice. Stick with it. But there's no randomized controlled trials. That's fine. But let's don't pretend that that was a science-based decision. Okay. So we need to up our game not only in the science, but also our integrity and our honesty. If there's a mistake, fix it. There's a great song by Eric Church called "I Learned That from a 3-Year-Old," and one of the lines is, "And when you're wrong, just say so." And I learned that from a 3-year-old. So if we're wrong, say so. I'm not going to go through all these mistakes. You can see some of them here, but in the interest of time, I won't go through all of them. But these are some of the many things we see that just completely invalidate things. And we've gotten them, some of them corrected and retracted. We'd like to prevent errors, and we think that involves creating habits that minimize the risk of errors, bias, or misconduct before they happen. Better to prevent than to fix afterwards. How do we prevent? We think pre-registration of studies will help. We think standardized protocols and training will help. Sharing study materials to increase transparency. And this may seem self-serving, and maybe it is, but I think having more professional statisticians involved, and I underline that phrase, professional statisticians, not your master's student who took one course in data science and tells you they know how to turn the computer on. Not your one professor who took two courses in statistics 30 years ago, and the department says, well, he or she is our stats guy. Talking about a professional statistician. How to avoid misconduct? We hope education matters. We hope monitoring of research protocols, enhanced peer review, protection of whistleblowers, etc., are all good ways to do that. As my friend Steve Austad said in a book he published, to err is human, to admit it is not. We find it difficult to admit our mistakes. I don't like to admit mistakes. I often tell people criticism is so valuable, including criticism of me. But I hate it. I hate being criticized. I especially hate it when it's in public. Nobody likes being criticized. And certainly most people don't like being publicly criticized. But I think we have to be open to it. An important thing is that in doing that, it makes it easier if the criticism is not about us, but it's about the ideas and the evidence. As a rule of thumb, for myself, I try, unless somebody's truly done something that's obviously malfeasant, and that almost never occurs in my experience with researchers, I will not attack a person. I will attack a study. I will attack an idea. I will attack a method, but I will not attack a person. Right? So I think we need to separate that out. Hey, there was a mistake in the study. Mistakes happen. Humans make mistakes. No recriminations. Just fix it. That's all. Maybe a little embarrassing that you made a mistake or the mistake was made in a paper you're the author of. It's okay. We all get embarrassed sometimes. Just fix it. I think we really need to up that. And I think the place to do that, the key leverage point there is the editor of the journal. And some editors are very good about this. And some editors are not. A lot of editors don't want the embarrassment of the journal having published a mistake. They don't want to antagonize the authors. They're worried about the authors suing them. The editors are busy. They themselves are untrained. They're fearful. They're tired. They don't have the staff. They don't want to deal with it. And so we find editors are very, again, not across the board, but many are very resistant to being at all helpful and fixing mistakes and fixing them in a timely fashion. Holden Thorpe, the editor of Science, has been very good about writing about these kinds of issues and talking about we don't need to figure out whether somebody engaged in misconduct or not and wait years for that to occur. We can just figure out whether there's something wrong with the paper. And if there's something wrong with the paper, then we can correct, flag, replace, retract as appropriate, and not make any judgment about the person. Let the institution do that. They can take their time. But we can make a decision on the paper more quickly. That commitment that a Holden Thorpe and Science have is not something that is shared by most journals. We need to get the editors to act with integrity and courage and speed. And they don't do that now as a class. Again, some editors are great. but editors in general, shame on you. Shame on the editors of journals who don't uphold things better. Now, how can we manipulate that in a good way? And I think that's where the federal government, at least within the United States, can be the absolute key driver. So the lever is the editor, but the one who can pull the lever is the federal government. I'll come back to that. We need to change a culture whereby people are encouraged to admit and fix their mistakes. This is not a new idea. Here you can see a 1991 paper on this, but it's true today. Jay Bhattacharya, who I mentioned earlier, said to me in a conversation when we were talking about these kinds of things, he said, we need to de-risk admitting error. And I'll go further and say we need to make it risky to not admit error when you know there is one, to not admit and fix it. And I think it is the NIH and the federal government that can do that. Here's examples where corrections did or didn't occur. This one that did occur, we were able to point out an error and it was fixed. Here's just some fun quotations of why it's important, both some statements of why it's important to correct and some fun quotations historically. We need errors to be corrected transparently. It shouldn't just show up that something was changed. The people that pointed out the errors deserve credit for pointing them out if they want it, if they don't want to be anonymous. We often find journals want to deny us that credit. We do a lot of work, and then they say, well, we'll fix it, but we're not going to mention you or publish your letter to the editor. And that denies our people credit for the important work they've done. But also, sometimes they just correct it and replace it without any note that anything was changed. And that's not good for the scientific record. Here's a very high-profile retraction recently. You may have some fun with. Again, I won't get into it, but you can take a look. This is a very common thing when you see cluster randomized trials, which are common particularly in childhood obesity intervention research. The proportion of them that are completely invalidly designed, analyzed, or interpreted is, in my experience, very high. And I don't have hard numbers on this. My subjective sense is it's on the order of about a third. That is, about a third of cluster randomized trials are invalid because of invalid design, analysis, or interpretation. This is a fun one, just shows the power of a little math. I saw this paper come out as a randomized controlled trial, 8 weeks. The treatment was a form of massage called meridian massage. A group of people who only started out at about 70 kilograms, which is not very heavy, lost more than 9% of their body weight and 3.7 kilograms more than a control group in 8 weeks. Now, anybody's ever tried to lose close to 10% of their body weight in 8 weeks, you know how hard that would be. It's possible, but it would be hard. So I looked at this and I said, that's sort of funny. And I went and did a little math on the data, and the authors had reported the baseline BMI, height, and weight. And then they reported the ending weight and BMI. And from there, using geometric means, I could approximate the mean change in height that would be required to make all those numbers check. And we did. And we found that people in the treatment group would have had to have grown in height about 6-point-something centimeters in 8 weeks. Well, most normal adults don't grow at all in height, let alone 6-point-something centimeters in 8 weeks. And so we said, this is implausible. We wrote to the authors to ask them to help us understand this and maybe share their data. They would not write back or did not write back. So then we wrote to the editor, who then wrote to the authors. Then they wrote back. And they said, oh, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Looks like we had a mistake. And then they published a correction in which the weight loss results were only half of what they were originally. So this shows the power of mathematics, simple math, right? This is junior high school algebra. It shows the importance of the editors weighing in, the reluctance of authors to fix until their feet are held to the fire, and the importance of checking. Here's another one where the authors acted much more appropriately. Some authors published a paper outlining a particular limitation on fast food meals for children in the United States, that if this policy were implemented such that fast food meals aimed at children, meals that included a toy is how they defined it, had a certain calorie limit, it would result in certain degree of less weight gain. And at first, I saw this claim of 2 pounds per year in the upper left panel. And I thought, that sounds ambitious. Do you really think you can avoid 2 pounds per year for a typical kid with just this policy? But then they had another thing saying that there were some kids that would gain, I think it was like 21 pounds a year or something, if they ate fast food 4 times a day. And there were people doing that. And that just seemed ridiculous. So Kevin Hall, I approached Kevin, who has a mathematical model of this, and we were able to show that because the authors had done their math incorrectly, that they were off by an order of magnitude. We wrote to the editor, who provided the information to the authors. The editor, to his or her credit, published our letter, and the authors, to their credit, said, we still think the method is good. That is the policy, rather. The proposed policy is good. But we agree with Dr. Allison and colleagues that we made a math mistake, and we're retracting our paper. And that goes back to that idea of evidence informed versus evidence dispositive, determined. The authors didn't say, well, now that the evidence has changed, we no longer think the policy is good. They still thought the policy was good, and good for them. That's their right. But they admitted that the facts were not what they were initially portended to be. All right. So to wrap up, I think there are 4 M's that we think can be really critically used. And these are mentoring, monitoring, methodology, and meta-science. You can see them listed here. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them in detail. These are sort of non-policy things. At the policy level, I think that right here, right now, there are 3 things we could prioritize. So we have since 1942, with Merton, I showed you earlier, talked about making science better. And we've done some steps, like we implemented IRBs, institutional review boards. We implemented clinical trials registries, etc. So there are many things we've done to make science better at the policy level, at the regulatory level, and I think we need to do more. Right here, right now, today, I think 3 things that are within easy, quick reach, if we just had the will to do them and could have huge impact, would come out of the federal government. And the first would be to say, we're making pre-registration of studies the norm and an enforceable norm for anyone who takes federal government money. Once you get those folks on board, then everybody else will follow. And it's not optional. And if you don't want to pre-register, there may be some situations where that can occur, but there will need to be some real recognition of that. The second will be the idea of data and code sharing. Data and code sharing become, again, the default norm. And to have an exception, there must be opportunities for exception. But to get an exception really requires some work and really a serious justification, not just saying, well, I can't do it. And I think, again, we say anybody who gets NIH funding, you must do this or you don't continue to get NIH funding. Once the NIH did that, the bricks will all fall into place. And then the last thing is, I think, the mandate to publish. To say, again, it is the norm and it is not a choice to publish the findings of your studies if you work at a nonprofit institution, because the reason you're at a nonprofit institution or an institution granted nonprofit status is in part because of the public good that you deliver. And the public good is in advancing knowledge. And you only advance knowledge when you put the knowledge out there, not when you hide it in your file drawers. So we say, okay, federal government comes and say, if you're not publishing your research, you're not fulfilling your mission as a nonprofit, and you'll be under threat for that status. Similarly, the NIH can say, if you took money from us as part of the federal government, the stipulation was you had to publish. If you don't, there may be fines or you may not get more money from us. And some people will say, well, it's a waste of time for me to publish my results. I even had one person say, a young person, it's an ethical dilemma, professor, I have. On the one hand, I feel like I should publish my paper. On the other hand, if I get null results, doing so won't advance my career, so I have an ethical dilemma. I said, no, that's not an ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma is when you have two different moral positions pushing you. This is just called a pain in the neck. An ethical dilemma, that's no more an ethical dilemma than my saying, for example, I have an ethical dilemma. I really need some extra cash right now, but I know it's illegal to rob banks, but banks are where the money is. And so should I rob the bank and solve my problem or not? That's not an ethical dilemma. No, you shouldn't rob the bank. It's ethically wrong, but you're in a difficult situation. And sometimes we have to live with difficult situations. And so I think we have to say, you've got to publish the paper, however boring it is. But you don't have to publish it in Science, and you probably won't. You don't even have to publish in a peer-reviewed journal. Just put it in a preprint server. Put it on your website. The word publish means to make public. It doesn't have to be peer-reviewed. It doesn't have to be in an index journal. It just has to be findable to the public. And I think if we just make that the rule, and it's an enforceable rule, we'll be in great shape, right? So data and code sharing that's truly enforced and enforceable. Pre-registration that's truly enforced and enforceable. And mandatory publication. Right? You took the lives of those rats or mice in your hands and you got IACUC approval. You spent that taxpayer money. You took the lives of people in your hands in your randomized controlled trial and you told them part of the justification is we can help them advance knowledge. You have an ethical obligation to put those data out there. So I think those are the three things we could do right here, right now. I'm going to skip all of this in the interest of time. And I'm just going to say at this point, thank you. These are some members of our group. In the leftmost panel, the one standing in what was my living room in Indiana. The person on the far right of that picture is Olivia Robertson, who helped put these slides together, and I thank her for them. The rest are other members of my team, past and present, and I'm so thankful for them. We have a lot of fun together. As Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, let us take this path through the woods. I'd love to talk with you more now when you have some questions, but I'd also love to talk with you more in the future. So if you're in the United States, I hope you'll stop by and go for a hike with us, and we can talk on the trail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Okay, I'm sure the talk probably will have generated questions. So if you have a question, we have about 20 to 25 minutes. If you have a question, please raise your hand with the React option on Zoom. I have a question just to start, maybe, or maybe Jonathan, is there someone in the room? Because it's very difficult for me to see if someone is raising their hands where you are.
There's a
Not yet.
question on the
Okay,
No,
not yet. Okay,
I have
so
a question. I have a question eventually, but yeah, waiting for
Looks
others
like
to come in.
Clarice Perron.
Clarice, okay, Clarice, go ahead, please.
Hello, sorry, just getting all my screens up. Thanks so much for your talk, Dr. Allison. One of my questions actually is about, um, I think you're pointing to a really important problem, which is the sort of lack of competency of a lot of scientists in statistics and statistical analysis to do sort of their modeling properly and how they're interpreting those results. Um, I guess I'm wondering from sort of a practical standpoint, like how your team and you are engaging in some of the um, sort of correction mechanisms. If you think some of the statistics is coming from like AI, or if you think that's kind of a problem that seems to be like, are people putting in models into AI and thinking that this is somehow giving them the right answers? Or do you think this is like just a lack of um, sort of more education, like scientists aren't getting sufficient training in statistics to be able to like look at the data themselves properly? Like I'm just kind of curious as to sort of your, I guess, sociological viewpoint on this, or where you see some of the gaps happening, or if you think it's kind of journal dependent. But thanks again for your chat.
Sure, thank you. With respect to AI, I have no direct data on this. I have an intuition. My intuition is that in the recent past, by which I mean 2, 3 years at most, sort of since Chat GPT sort of, came on our consciousness, and in the near future, AI is being used, has been used, will be used by some people to do some statistical analyses, and doing so will cause some mistakes. But I have no direct data on that. That's just what I think. Prior to 3-ish years ago, my guess is there was very little use of AI in the sense that we use it now to produce results or do statistical analyses. And I doubt that was the root of many mistakes. I think the root is sometimes sort of just statistics is hard, research is hard. Sometimes people make mistakes. It is, I think, occasionally obfuscation, particularly in the areas of things like cluster randomized trials, where I think some of the mistakes are not honest errors. We had one paper where I sent it around and I thought there was a mistake in the cluster randomized trial analysis. And indeed there was. The authors didn't take clustering into account in their analysis. And I sent it to my mentorees. They confirmed what I was thinking. And then one of them wrote back and said, Dr. Allison, are you aware that you actually wrote a letter to the editor about this exact same mistake, but in a different paper for the same authors a few years ago? And it was the authors in public in the journal admitted that you were right and they made a mistake and they corrected the paper. And I said, wow, I didn't pick that up. And my mentoree then said, once is a mistake, twice is a decision. So, that's a situation where you say, this really seems disingenuous. This just seems like somebody is intentionally using the wrong method because they like the answers it gives. And then I think the third situation, which is perhaps the most common, it is a lack of expertise, due in part to a lack of training. And that's where I go back to the idea of a professional statistician being important. If I get a sore throat, for example, and I think, this might be, a cold, and I'll take some honey, and so it might be true, it might work, and might be appropriate. On the other hand, I'm not a professional physician, and maybe I would not think to say, well, maybe it's strep throat. Maybe I can check that and diagnose it. And if it is strep throat, it can be treated with something else, and probably should be. That's where you want a professional involved. And we see many, many mistakes in which someone who has a little statistical knowledge is either doing the statistical analysis themselves or having their graduate student do it or so on. And again, I don't want the professional mechanical engineer having their graduate student who took one course in mechanics checking the 747 before I get on it. I want a professional who's trained in checking 747s before they take off to check it. And I think that we need more professional statisticians who understand when things go wrong, how to check assumptions, what the alternatives are, and so on. I talk to National Academy of Science members as an example. I'm talking about the pinnacle, seasoned, successful investigators who do rodent studies. And I say, when you do these rodent studies, you ever group house your animals? All the animals given diet A versus diet B, are they housed? Oh, yeah. I do that, I group house. I say, well, when you do that, do you take the group housing clustering or the so-called cage effect into account in your analysis? Or how do you do that? And they say, cage effect? What is that? What are you talking about? They have no idea, right? And yet, for them, it's okay to have their master student or even their statistician do the work. And the statistician may never have been in a mouse lab and may not know enough to ask, did you group house? And the physiologist doesn't know enough about statistics to say, should I tell you that I group house these? Well, can you take that into account in your analysis? And so it's never brought up and it's never dealt with. These are some of the problems we have.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer.
Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, David. So one question I had, I guess it's kind of a relationship to thinking about, when at times, and especially in the cases of nutrition science, the idea, the need to ask for more rigor at times can also shift a little bit the kind of the evidential goalpost, so to speak. So for instance, at times, if you're testing a kind of given hypothesis, and each time we observe evidence to the contrary of this hypothesis, the problem that the authors suggest is not actually with the hypothesis, but just with the evidence or the methods. And so they don't change the hypothesis. They just say, well, for instance, we need longer trials in this case in order to test to get real evidence to test our hypothesis. I have specific cases in mind, I suppose, around some nutritional causes of obesity. But I was curious to know what you think about this challenge.
Sure. So let's contrast perhaps three different situations. One situation might be something where I say, for example, I think that eating this food more and that food less will lead to longer life. An example might be, I think eating more liquid seed oils and less beef tallow will lead to longer life. Or alternatively, you think eating more beef tallow and less liquid seed oils will lead to longer life. Now let's contrast that with Einstein's prediction that light would bend toward the sun because of gravity and his theory of special relativity. And then finally, let's contrast that with, do you know the character Morpheus from The Matrix?
Mm-hmm.
With Morpheus's statement at one point when somebody says to him, not everybody shares your beliefs, and it's sort of a belief in God. And he said, my beliefs do not require that you share my beliefs. So these are three different things. The last one with Morpheus, we call that faith. We don't call that science. So if somebody says, as an example, I believe in God, and I say, well, but evidence, what evidence do you have? And you can't prove it. And they say, I don't care. My belief is not based on evidence. I just believe. That's it. Okay. But we don't call that science. We call that religion. So there, all the data in the world don't matter because it's not about data. Now we go to Einstein's situation, where he says to the reporter, if Lord Eddington had not obtained a result that supported my theory, his experiment would have been wrong, because I know my theory's right. He's got a lot of math behind him at that point. That's very different than my liquid oil versus beef tallow. Right? There's not a lot of math that proves that liquid oil is better than beef tallow or beef tallow is better than liquid oil. It's very much an empirical question where we don't exactly know a priori. But Einstein, he's close to faith, but he's not there. He's got math behind him, right? And the math includes some assumptions about physical reality, and those are empirical. So there's an openness, but a limited openness. From a Bayesian point of view, Einstein had what we would call a very, very strong prior probability. It is going to take a lot of data to move that. And that's okay. That's how it should be, right? We wouldn't want to have overturned it on, one bad observation. And then you go to something like the diet, where I say, my diet is going to be better than your diet for this outcome. And you might say to me, well, how much better? What's your alternative hypothesis? Exactly how many more kilograms of weight loss, or how many more years of life, or whatever? I say, I don't know exactly. I just think more. Well, that shows there's not a lot of math behind that. There's a lot of feedback, right? Could be, oh yeah, this will lower LDL cholesterol more, but the whole world is in LDL cholesterol. What if it doesn't, what if it differentially affects blood pressure or happiness or who knows what? And I think if you're not changing your mind, if you're not updating your beliefs based on data as it accumulates, then you're not being a scientist. You're not engaging in science. That doesn't mean you have to turn them around. Doesn't mean we all have to accept the same thing. But Lee McIntyre, in his book, The Scientific Attitude, defines science as what scientists do. And he says what scientists do is they pose questions about the real world. They make some observations about the real world. And then they potentially update their beliefs based on those observations. And if you're doing that, and you're trying to do it in an objective, controlled way, that's the scientific method. And anything else about, what people say, the scientific method, is not true. It's just that simple, abstract thing. But it involves being open to updating your ideas. So that's critical. In his book, The Knowledge Machine, Michael Strevens takes this on very well. And he says, we don't need unbiased scientists. In fact, unbiased scientists probably wouldn't be very effective. Our biases are good. Our aggression, our quest for dominance, our dogmatism, it's good. It drives us. Science is hard, so you need that motivation. But he points out Newton being a closet Unitarian while he's a professor at Trinity College, right? You can't come out as a professor at Trinity College at that point in time and say, I'm a Unitarian. So Einstein has the Unitarian part hidden in his private life, publicly not. Same thing, he's got the alchemy hidden in his private life. Publicly, he's doing optics, universal law of gravitation, calculus, and so on. And Strevin says that's what we need. You can go back to the lab and say, I want to prove that it's low carb is better than high carb, or low fat is better than low carb, or whatever you want to do. And that's good. It's going to drive you to do the rigorous test. But then when you and I come out for the debate publicly, then Strevin says it has to be a commitment to the iron rule of evidence. So I can go back to my lab and be all motivated by wanting to beat you and wanting to be right and stick to my guns. But when I come out in public and debate you, we need to say, this needs to be based on evidence. And if you say, well, I did the study, and I say, well, I don't trust your study because it was too short. I said, okay, David, how long should it be? Let's agree to that. Now let's do that study and keep moving forward.
Okay, thanks. Did you have a question as well?
Sure, I can, if no one else. Hi, I'm Fridolin Groß, a colleague of Jonathan's in Bordeaux. The examples you used were, for the most part, very close to application, to policy decisions, etc. So my question is, would you enforce the same standards regarding basic science? So when people are investigating, I don't know, fundamental mechanisms of cell biology, that are very far from any possible application or therapy, or is there a risk of stifling research if you enforce these very strict standards about, for example, pre-registering experiments and so on?
I think that the principles apply. The practices may be different in certain contexts. Pre-registering is probably the best example of where the practices might be different. And I think that, as I've written elsewhere, including with my colleague, Dr. Alexis Wood, in a paper in Pediatrics, we think that rigor is compromisable. That is, it is okay to not have every study be the most rigorous it can be. But transparency is not compromisable. So, for example, if a cell biologist said, I ran 20 different studies and I was, moving quickly and exploring, and I tried things, and then on the basis of what I found, I thought about trying something else, and I did, and here are some results of what I found. But I was moving quickly and exploring and playing, and I didn't pre-register all of that. I think that's fine, but just say it, right? Don't pretend otherwise. And then people like me, the reader, we can judge how much trustworthiness, how much trust I want to put in that science as a result of that statement. But it must be specified. I think in other situations, we may want to make it mandatory, such as when you're dealing with new data collection on human subjects or something like that.
Thanks.
I had a quick question on what you said towards the end in terms of recommendations. And I was wondering if, in fact, there is data, for example, on how much currently is published by people who are funded by NIH. So to say things more clearly, I was a little bit surprised that you seem to suggest that a significant number of NIH-funded projects, in fact, do not end up being published. Is there data about that?
I don't know off the top of my head whether there are data specifically on NIH-funded projects. My guess is there are some data, but I'm just not aware of them at the moment. Maybe some of my team who are on the call, if they're aware of it, they can jump in. But I know that more generally, people, including us, have looked at whether across the board or in certain sub areas of science, how often raw data will be forthcoming. And the answer is, it is a marked minority of the cases in which raw data will be forthcoming. There's a fun paper out there somewhere, and I forget the exact title, but it's something like data available upon request, not. And we see this all the time. It says data will be available upon request, or often the word upon reasonable request. And then we request the data. And we suddenly find, I guess we're not reasonable because the authors are refusing to either answer our email at all, or they say, well, we still want to do some publications on it, so no, we're not going to give you the data, or now in retrospect, we can't find them, or the IRB won't allow us to, et cetera. So it is by far the majority of papers do not make raw data available.
Thank you very much. Clarice.
Hi, sorry, I know I already asked a question, so if anybody else, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but it did occur to me that your recommendations do seem like things that really should come from federal government agencies that can actually regulate and enforce like better scientific practices. However, you did mention that there's more than one player at stake here. There's different people who are accountable to ensuring improved trustworthiness in science. And I wonder how you would recommend incentivizing journals, for instance, and editors to do better jobs um, in trying to catch and review papers that are clearly making pretty big errors that it seems like should be caught in the first place. So as much as like I do appreciate the recommendations going towards studies funded through federal agencies. There's another player in the game, and they're an important player because they're the ones that are making this information public. So yeah, I'm just curious how you would try to incentivize or recommend for better accountability practices in journals when they're sort of funded by their own means.
Depends on the practice. If it's a practice that the federal government can mandate of, among other people, their grantees, then it's easy peasy. And this is exactly what happened with clinical trials registration and, to a large extent, public access. The federal government, let's just say NIH, David Allison, you got an NIH grant. When you take that money, or your institution takes that money, you're essentially engaging in a contract with us. And the contract says, I'll do these certain behaviors. And if you don't do them, you've defrauded the federal government. And that's called a crime. And bad things happen. So when the federal government said, you must pre-register your randomized controlled trial in humans, then people do it. And then the journals follow suit. All you need to say is, hey, journals, if you don't allow this, or we're going to have a problem with you. And if you say, authors, you must do this, and if you don't, we're not going to let you publish in that journal anymore. It's done, right? You may say, but not everybody has an NIH grant. Doesn't matter. As soon as the big journals are told nobody with NIH grants can publish in a journal anymore, they're going to comply.
Awesome, thank you.
All right. I don't see any other questions. Is there a final question or comment by anyone in the virtual room? Okay, then I think we should. Oh, is there one, Jonathan? Sorry, I see hands, but okay, you do. Please go ahead.
I'll sneak one last one in. Just because it's on the other end of this spectrum in a sense. I mean, you've listed a good amount of cases as well in nutrition. I mean, mentioning some going through of cases where we need to retract papers and to fix these kinds of errors in evidence and the sort. So I guess I'm also wondering whether it would be useful and whether we could kind of develop a sort of repository in nutrition science of actually highly trustworthy papers and findings in that sense that we would want to sort of collect and stand up as saying this is really trustworthy nutrition science. These are some almost hard facts, so to speak, within nutrition.
I think it would be a great thing to do as kind of an exemplar, as opposed to stating that this is a or the collection of trustworthy things. It's more like an awards thing, when you have the Academy Awards for movies. There's not something which says objectively this is exactly the 10 best movies ever made or this year or whatever. This is what the committee picked as they thought these were really cool or good or interesting, and you might like to know that too. And I think if it's done that way, I think it'd be a great idea. My group and I talked about running we called it a tournament, where we'd somehow take pairs of papers and keep pitting them against each other and have some outside reviewers rate them for rigor, and until we got to, a subset, and then say, hey, these are great exemplars. And we never did it because we didn't have the person power to do it. But if there's some really smart postdoc or grad student on this in this meeting who wants a dissertation topic or something and wants to collaborate, I hope they'll pick it up.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay.
Well, I want to say thank you again. It's truly been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, David. That was very, very interesting and very helpful. So thank you very much. And well, see you next time in Bordeaux or in the US.
I look forward to it. Be well, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks again.